HR. Cool. Maybe I'll just start the introduction again then, since the recording just started. We are really, really thrilled at Worcester Addresses Childhood Trauma to have Dr. Jerry Carbo here today. Yay. He is a lawyer and a PhD, faculty member with an expertise on organizing, right? Union, labor history. Also has been in HR. So he has the experience of really understanding multiple perspectives of this issue, knowing sort of what we're grounded in, what we're missing, all of it. I'm so glad he's here today. I think that this is one of those topics that if people had heard about it before they entered the workplace or knew something about it. Jerry was just telling me in advance of starting that he talks to students about this. And I just think, wow, if you had gotten some conversation about this when you were a student, that might have saved a lot of workplace heartache. I know for me, I never even heard the phrase workplace bullying until maybe 2017, and really didn't have a sense at all of what it was or how it impacted people. And until I started sort of doing my own work and then recognizing that this is a big phenomenon, it really falls beneath legal protection in a lot of ways. And Jerry's just going to talk to us again about how much damage this does to people that are victims of this, how much damage it does to society. I so appreciate also that Dr. Carbo is bringing a social justice lens to this topic and recognizing that this is a justice issue. This issue really impacts people of color, really impacts women, anyone with a disability. If you are already in any sort of disenfranchised, marginalized group, the likeliness of being a victim and, of course, not having the resources you need to come out the other side goes up a lot. And Jerry will talk more about that. So again, I just want to welcome everyone here. We're so glad you're here. We had to put in the Zoom waiting room because Zoom is worried about us getting Zoom bombed. I don't think we will. Never have before. And again, I think almost many people have been to Trauma Training Tuesday before, but if you haven't, our intention is just to really lift up a certain type of experience as a trauma and have people understand what it looks like. And the hope is that from that, people will be more empathetic and understanding. And also, if you're the victim of a trauma, that it'll help you to see, to not take it so personally, to see that your reactions and responses are pretty much exactly what we would expect. And you can really feel that when somebody kind of lists it out and you go, oh yeah, that's me. And I know that's what's going to happen today. I'm so excited that Jerry's here. I know he has been working on this issue a long time, has prepped a lot. I watched the compilation video you made about testimony, and wow, that was intense. Yeah, really intense.
Definitely was. Yep.
All right, so I'm going to turn it on over to you because I'm a talker. So
okay.
I will I'll monitor the chat. So if people have questions for you, do you want to have questions held to the end or jump?
Yeah. So I think as we get to maybe some points, I'll sort of say, well, that's sort of that topic. And if there are questions that might be answered later on, if you notice those, we can maybe address those at the end. But if there's some questions that don't really get addressed in the rest of the presentation or you think may not, I'll go ahead and answer those throughout type of thing. So I'll try to work in some breaks. You know, I'm also a talker, as all of my students can tell you. You know, I'm one of those professors where they're looking at the clock and we're about 5 minutes over time and they're thinking, how am I getting to my next class? So, but I will try to incorporate some breaks and some opportunity for some feedback. So
that sounds great. So right there with you, I'm going to mute myself so that it's all you.
Okay. And I am going to share screen here, and I know this sometimes takes a minute. Yeah, so hopefully that's kicked in. Is everybody seeing the slideshow? Excellent. Excellent. So yeah, just a little bit of my background. Amy, hit all of the major points. Again, I am a professor at Shippensburg University. It has been, looking back at my career at this point, it's been 25 years almost that I've been working to prevent, detect, remedy, and eliminate bullying and harassment in the workplace. I worked as an HR manager for two Fortune 50 companies, hoping that I could take steps there to eliminate bullying and harassment, implemented anti-harassment policies for those companies, moved on to academia after that, worked as a consultant. I've worked in with labor unions. I've worked as a union member and as a elected union official to address this issue. And now I'm the president of the National Workplace Bullying Coalition, and we take a multifaceted approach to what we hope will be achieving those goals of prevention, detection, remedying, and eliminating. And so I just wanted to share real quickly the National Workplace Bullying Coalition. Our vision is through education and mobilization, we envision a future where workers are assured their right to dignity at work. And so everything that we do is we really try to flip the script on the U.S. employment system. In U.S. employment law, we are very much a negative rights system, which means really these are the things that you have a right not to have happen to you in the workplace. And what we've seen is that that type of system fails to protect workers. And so we really want to flip this to say this is what you have a right to. And at a minimum, we think you have a right to what are recognized as your human rights. And dignity is considered one of the main pillars of human rights. And so we say everyone should have this right to dignity at work. And we go on from that to say workplace bullying should be unlawful because we know that these behaviors violate that dignity, and as well as causing all kinds of other harms. And so we, want to eliminate this through all types of different avenues. We work on collective bargaining and concerted activity. We work on education. We work on outreach. We have a research team, and we have a team that focuses on legislation and specifically focuses on the Dignity at Work Act, which in Massachusetts was recently had a hearing at the Joint Labor Committee, and that was the testimony that Amy was referring to. And if you haven't had an opportunity, strongly recommend that you look at that testimony because those are the real experts testifying. It's targets of workplace bullying that were testifying. And it's just incredible testimony. We have a compilation video, which is a few minutes, but I also strongly recommend you watch the full video, which includes full testimony of everyone who is willing to allow us to put that onto a recording. And it might take a couple times of sitting through. I'll tell you that during the testimony, even though my work has been talking to targets because I'm a qualitative researcher, and so I've heard these stories typically one at a time, it was very heart-wrenching hearing 20 plus of these stories. And I had to take a break a couple of times. I had to step out of the room, sort of collect myself, talk to my wife for a little bit and be like, wow, I just need a break from this. But it's well worth it if you can get through it because they are the real experts. If you're interested in joining with us, I have a couple of links here. Hopefully you'll explore those. Our webpage is workplacebullyingcoalition.org. You can explore that as well as the dignityatworkact.org. So today I'm going to talk about understanding harassment and bullying in the workplace. And just to give you an agenda so you know where we're going at each step. The first step is I want to talk about how we define workplace bullying and how we come up with this definition of workplace bullying. And then from there, the next step is really to identify it, because even though we have a definition, what we need to be able to do is identify what are some of the behaviors. And I say some because one of the things I'll talk about is bullies are are really creative. And so the idea that we'll ever have a list of all of the different bullying behaviors is just not a good way to approach this, because bullies will always find different ways. But I want to give you some ideas, some things that we have found, some things I have found in my research, some things other researchers have found to be workplace bullying. Then I want to talk about the effects of workplace bullying, and then understanding why it occurs the best that we can, because the research is really lacking in terms of talking to bullies and getting full information from bullies. And so we don't always know, especially that those micro level causes, but we're a little bit better at sort of the macro level causes as well as the organizational or meso level causes. And then I want to talk about what can be done to address workplace bullying at all three levels as well. This is a macro problem, so I'm a firm believer in macro solutions. I think we need societal level solutions. It's a problem that's created by organizations, so organizations have a role, but there are also things that can be done until we get there that targets as well as bystanders might be able to do to at least help to alleviate some of the worst effects of bullying and harassment. So I just want to start off with that definition section. And so one of the things I think is helpful to understand is to maybe relate workplace bullying to something you might be a little bit more familiar with, and in particular, workplace harassment. And we oftentimes hear in the media the term sexual harassment used, and so we're a little more familiar with that, and we see examples of that, both from a legal standpoint as well as my own perspective and research standpoint. I tend to avoid using that term because there's some confusion with it. When we hear the term sexual harassment, we oftentimes think of it as being sexualized. The reality is that when we talk about gender harassment, only about 1 in 10 cases of gender harassment have any sexual nature to them. And so we really want to deal with the broader harassment. And gender harassment itself is also a better term, but not the best term, because when we talk about the different types of harassment in the US, gender harassment is the most common. It's about 1/3 of cases that go to the EEOC, but it doesn't include all the other cases. Any type of harassment that's based upon a protected status, so race-based harassment, national origin harassment, religious harassment, age status over 40 harassment, disability harassment. So I like to use the term unlawful harassment. But here I'm just trying to sort of lay out a definition. And we have this Code of Federal Regulations, and this also sort of mirrors the EEOC definition of harassment. And what's particularly important is the third section of the definition, which is, we can start at the top, unwelcome conduct that is objectionable, where such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. This legal definition really gives us a nice jumping off point to understanding workplace bullying, because it's a form of workplace bullying. And so when we look at the EEOC, which helps us to take a little step further to say, here's how we define unlawful harassment in its totality, whether that be gender harassment, national origin harassment, or any other form of unlawful harassment. We put all these elements together. And so the EEOC tells us it's unwelcome, offensive conduct that is based on race, color, sex, religion, national origin, disability, or age status over 40. And harassment becomes unlawful where enduring the offensive conduct becomes a condition of continued employment, or the conduct is severe or pervasive enough to create a working environment that a reasonable person would consider intimidating, hostile, or abusive. So, I have an asterisk here. And I asterisk the severe or pervasive standard. The reason I do that is the Supreme Court has used that standard over and over again. Meritor Savings Bank, it's discussed. Forklift case, it's really part of the holding of the case. And then we see it discussed again in Farragher and Elrith cases, and those are in the late 1990s. The Meritor case is now 35 years old. Forklift case is around 30 years old now. But this has been the standard. But what we see is a number of circuit courts use a severe and pervasive standard. It's really a twisting of what this standard is. And I just always want to make people aware of that, especially potential targets, because there are a lot of gaps, even if you have this conduct perpetuated or perpetrated against you. There are a lot of gaps in the law that make it really tough to bring a claim forward. And one of those is really that definition. What do we mean by severe or pervasive? And just to give you an idea, one of the most respected jurists of the modern era, Judge Posner, wrote a decision in Baskerville v. Colligan case, where in essence he laid out the standard that severe or pervasive means a hellish environment. And dozens of courts and decisions have followed since then. And so for all of those jurisdictions, there's this really high standard of harm that you have to show. And so that's another gap that we hope to fill with our work on workplace bullying, is to not just address the gap of status-based, but to address the gap of how we look at these behaviors. So when we talk about workplace bullying versus harassment, the first thing is bullying does not have to be based on a protected or any other status, right? This automatically, when we say it has to be status-based, in other words, it has to be based on a protected status, race, color, national origin, gender, age status over 40, disability, or religion, we eliminate about 3/4 of the incidents of workplace bullying. That means that we leave 75% of targets at step one without any protection. And so the first thing is we eliminate that. You know, this is behavior. We're focusing on the behavior, not on the status, not on discrimination. For 3 years, I served on the EEOC Select Task Force to study workplace harassment. And even there, the commissioners of the EEOC, as well as the other experts in the room, were pretty clear that, you know, the Title VII and the other EEO laws, not the best way to address harassment, because they're really focused on discrimination. And so it really leaves this big gap, and it focuses on that rather than the behavior. And so with talking about workplace bullying, we want to bring the focus back to the behavior, not the status. We want to focus on the harm to the target, right? We want to, and one of the things that we do at the National Workplace Bullying Coalition is to engage in a positive protection to the right to dignity and esteem in the workplace. Again, bullies are really creative. And so anything that's harming that dignity or esteem or other human rights in the workplace, we believe the target should have a right to have that corrected. Workplace bullying can be typical harassing behaviors, but what we're seeing more and more, and I'll talk about the difference between these two, is that employment practices are being used as a way to bully. And so a couple of ways that I've seen this in my own research. The use of scheduling has been used to bully individuals. Well, that's an employment practice. We don't typically think of that as a harassing behavior. It's not what we would see on TV. It's not what's depicted in the media or in the general press or in movies or even books. But it's a common tactic that's used. So we mess with someone's schedule to, in essence, mess with them. I work with teachers a lot. So if any of you are teachers, this might sound familiar to you. Classroom assignments are used. Transferring to different grade levels is used as a form of bullying. Another one is the use of performance management systems and performance appraisal systems, oftentimes used as a method of bullying. One of the employment practices that I experienced back when I was in HR was in a manufacturing facility, and we had a supervisor on one of our lines building industrial air conditioners, and this line was a raised line, so it was up on rollers, sort of like a train track. And there is a little area below the train track where a lot of the heat from the system itself blew out. And for one reason or another, over the years, they had set up the insulation position in that area, and it became called the pit because of where it was located, as well as the heat. And what this supervisor would do is, if anybody gave him any problems, he put them in the pit. And so these workers there were exposed to this heat all day, and this was in the deep south. And we did have air conditioning in the building, unlike actually our sister organization on the other side of the state that was an air conditioning company but had no air conditioning for their workers. We at least had air conditioning, but still that heat would be blowing on them all day. They're cutting insulation. All this insulation's getting all over their bodies, their faces. You know, they had safety glasses and sleeves that they could wear, but those were also hot. And you know, it's almost a form of torture that they would endure for these 8-hour days. And he used that employment practice as a form of bullying, and it's something that we did correct when we found out what was going on. The other thing is, you know, intent does not matter, other than when we look at the remedy of workplace bullying, right? If we're looking to correct the behavior, if it's a mistaken behavior by a bully, well, there's a different way that we correct that. We would, you know, maybe engage in training. But if it's an intentional behavior, then we're going to have to take different measures, probably punitive measures. But we're not so focused on intent because we want to make the target whole. We're also not focused on intent because one of the things I'll mention a few times today is for targets, proving the intent is almost impossible. Researchers have made this conclusion in our own system of workplace harassment. We see that CFR, and just a reminder, it says purpose or effect, right? And so that means that intent doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if you have the intent to harm. And so we make sure that we define bullying without using that intent requirement. And then the last thing is, what my research really quickly showed, even during my dissertation, is that single events can be bullying as well as repetitive events. And that concept has been confirmed over the years. In particular, we see that confirmed in Quebec, where there is a law against workplace bullying. It's a law against what they call psychological harassment. And in studies of Quebec, while single incident claims of psychological harassment are in the minority, it's about 1/3 of the claims, what they found is those claims were more successful in their labor court than the repetitive events. About 50% of those claims being held or being found to be a form of workplace bullying. So single events are also very common. The other piece of this is one of the big discussions at the EEOC Select Task Force was we want to address these issues early, right? We want to prevent these from being irreparable harm. We want to address them ideally before they're harmful. We want to address them so that the employment relationship can continue. And so if we ignore single events, we lose out on that opportunity. So a couple of differences between harassment and bullying. Harassment is unlawful when it's discriminatory, unlawful under the EEO laws, which are Title VII, the ADA, the ADEA, and your state human rights laws. So that's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. It is unlawful not necessarily because of the behavior, not a focus on the behavior, but it's unlawful as a form of discrimination. Right? And this opens up the door to a lot of problems. And we've actually seen some of these problems litigated, in particular, the equal opportunity offender. So because the only way to show a harassment claim, an unlawful harassment claim, is you have to show that you're being treated differently than individuals in a non-protected status or in not in the status that you're claiming. So in other words, if you claim that you are being harassed because of your gender, what you have to show is that the other gender is not being exposed to those same incidents. So it's a form of discrimination. If you can't show that, then you don't have a claim. And so sort of hate to say this, but sort of the smart harasser or the smart bully becomes the equal opportunity bully. And in my own legal work, I've had at least 2 bullies in the past probably 4 or 5 years who have used that defense in both with the PA Human Rights Commission and the EEOC, saying, look, I'm just, you know, sort of a blunt type of guy, and, you know, and I'm sort of rough in the workplace. And so it's not that I was discriminating. I just treat everybody this way, right? And so the whole workforce is treated that way. And that's bad public policy. So the National Workplace Bullying Coalition's focus on bullying is it should be unlawful because it violates the right to dignity. What we know, again, 75% of bullying incidents are not based upon a protected status. So we're leaving 3 out of 4 targets automatically are not included in our legal protections in the United States. Many bullying incidents do not rise to that severe and or pervasive standard as it has been defined by the lower courts. I mean, just imagine if you are in the circuit court, and I believe Posner is in the 7th Circuit. So if you're in the 7th Circuit, just imagine what you have to show to rise to the level of a hellish environment. Right, but that's the standard that he set out. That's how he defined severe or pervasive. And people are greatly harmed. Targets are greatly harmed well before they get to that level. In fact, one of my frustrations with workplace bullying research, even with the NAQ, which I'll discuss in a bit, the NAQ, the individuals who developed that, the researchers who developed that, define bullying as something that occurs on a regular basis for so many months. And then in their other research, they talk about the fact that for targets of bullying, by the time that they're identified as as targets, they've already suffered irreparable harm. Well, to me, what we want to do is we want to avoid the irreparable harm, right? And so what we need to do is not narrow the definition, but expand the definition. So we're preventing that harm. You know, some of my really early work, even before I got into this, dealt with medical malpractice and the sort of the push to limit medical malpractice claims. And it's sort of the same thing that I saw there. Nobody who's filing a medical malpractice claim wanted that malpractice to happen to them, right? They wanted to prevent that. And that was the goal. That was their primary goal. And it's the same for targets. They want to prevent the harm, right? And so we need to take these early steps to do so. The other thing that we see is that these incidents are severely damaging to organizations, targets, society, families, and so it's something that needs to be addressed. And there's a strong public policy reason to address workplace bullying. So when we talk about bullying and harassment, I think the best way to view it is unlawful harassment. It's a form of workplace bullying, right? It's workplace bullying that is based upon a protected status, but it's just one component. And what Namey's research would suggest is it's probably about 25% component. You know, whether or not that's accurate or not doesn't really, to me, matter. It's just, this is just one form. And what we know is we have a lot more to address if we really want to protect targets of workplace bullying. So leaves us with brings us to the elements of bullying. And these are the elements that we tend to see in the research. We tend to see intent included in the research, which is really frustrating because almost all researchers of workplace bullying have come to the conclusion you can't prove intent. A target's never going to be able to prove intent, especially not what we call specific intent. Specific intent from a legal standpoint means it's the intent to actually cause the harm. General intent means it's just the intent to engage in a behavior. Well, typically if you engaged in a behavior, unless you were incapacitated in some way, we can prove general intent. We prove it by you did the behavior, right? And you had capacity to know what you were doing. But specific intent is generally what's talked about here when that's included in the definition. And that means showing that the bully intended to cause an individual harm, and that's impossible to show. Even our U.S. system of law has decided that. There are very few specific intent torts. Most torts are general intent torts, or personal injury claims are general intent claims. The Supreme Court, when talking about workplace harassment, has said intent doesn't matter. The Code of Federal Regulations has said intent doesn't matter. And so we don't include intent in our definition of workplace bullying. The issue of repetitive or single incident, again, we view both of these the same. Single incidents are very common. Single incidents can be just as damaging. And so we believe a definition, we should be really careful about even suggesting to individuals that it's only bullying if it's repetitive. And we see this with workplace harassment. One of the cases I teach my students about is a case where an executive um, uh, had an administrative assistant come into his office after working hours or late in the day when most people had left the building, and he pinned her against the door and groped her before she was able to escape. She brought a claim, filed a claim of gender-based harassment against him, went through the EEOC. The EEOC found this to be gender-based harassment. A jury found this to be gender-based harassment, and a judge overruled the case saying it wasn't because it was a single incident. And that is a ludicrous decision, right? And my students see that that's a ludicrous decision. That's assault, much less harassment. But when we focus on the need for repetitive, we take the risk of eliminating those types of incidents from protection, or for those types of targets from protection. So we look to avoid that. One of the things that does have to exist in my findings of workplace bullying is there has to be a source of power. And that can be any source of power. It doesn't have to be formal, right? But for bullying to have the effect on targets, there has to be some source of power. And I'll talk about what those can be in a bit when we look at identifying workplace bullying. The behavior, of course, has to be unwanted, right? If somebody wants the behavior, well, that's not bullying. And the behavior has to be objectionable. So that brings us to this definition. And this definition is based upon years of research. It's based upon a review of international laws in Sweden, Belgium, Quebec, as well as common law methods of addressing workplace bullying in places like Germany and the UK. And it's most importantly based upon discussions and research of dozens of targets of workplace bullying. And so what I have found, and what the Workplace Bullying Coalition has adopted to be their definition, is that workplace bullying shall be defined as the unwanted abuse of any source of power that has the effect of or intent to intimidate, control, or otherwise strip a target of his or her right to esteem, growth, dignity, voice, or other human rights in the workplace. Workplace bullying may take the form of moral, psychological, or general harassment, incivility, abusive supervision, violence, mobbing, aggressions, and other types of objectionable behaviors. A couple of reasons for that second sentence. That second sentence encompasses what we've learned from other jurisdictions. Moral harassment, that's what the French term is for workplace bullying. That's what their law addresses. It's a law against moral harassment. In France, moral harassment in the workplace is both a civil offense and a criminal offense. So bullies can go to jail in France for being bullies in the workplace. Psychological harassment comes from the Quebec definition. General harassment is just, this idea that it's harassment that's not based upon a protected status. And then we have these other terms: incivility, abusive supervision, workplace violence. The reason for this is there's a growing consensus in the bullying research amongst researchers that we need to start bringing these different forms of abuse under one window, or under one umbrella. They really are the same type of events. They really have the same type of effects, and we're really doing a disservice by treating them as discrete, different constructs. In particular, as an action researcher, it's concerning when we have all of these different constructs, because what I know is employers are not going to have policies that address each and every one of these. You're not going to be able to negotiate collective bargaining agreement articles that address each and every one of these. In other words, having 6, 7 different articles, 6, 7 different policies. And then what's critical is, if we're going to address this, we need a law. And there is no chance that we're going to get 7 different laws passed. A law on incivility, a law on abusive supervision. So what we need to do is we need to bring this into one term. And honestly, I don't care what the term is. You know, we are the National Workplace Bullying Coalition. That was our name before I joined the organization. My research initially was on workplace bullying using that terminology, and that's why I adopt it. But if it's abusive, workplace abuse, that's the better term, then let's adopt that. Let's include everything. Let's address it. So the other thing that we do is I mentioned general harassment. And here what we do is really just adopt the legal definition of unlawful harassment in the US, but we take away the requirement of the protected status. So, you know, that sort of subset that I mentioned. And I think that this is an okay way. This is an okay definition to address the broader phenomena as well. But there are some gaps, again, that, you know, in my studies that we have found. Again, that severe pervasive standard, right? It sounds good, sounds okay. The Supreme Court interpreted it well, but what we see is some lower courts, like Judge Posner, didn't interpret it very well, and so it leaves a gap, which is why we have this as an additional component, second sentence of our definition. Okay, so next I'm going to go into specific examples of bullying, both from my research as well as other research and looking at the NAQ. But I just wanted to, you know, this would be a good place if you have any questions about defining workplace bullying or the difference between harassment and bullying, that I could address those.
Jerry, Bill had put in the chat that he did want to, you know, hear a little bit more about the environment. And I think I had told you ahead of time that he worked in law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we know that that is well known for having a toxic culture, dare I say. So I don't know if this is a good time to speak to that a little bit, or if later would be better, whatever you think. But Bill's
Yeah, so I think both, because that's a critical component. So I will talk about it a little bit later in terms of the antecedents, but in terms of workplace harassment as well as general bullying, there is no doubt that the culture of an organization is an antecedent, or can be preventative if it's a positive culture. And really, that organizational piece, I'm going to talk about different levels of what we need to solve it. And one of my dissertation committee members was Lance Compa. And I think he put it best, is to solve any employment issue, we need a three-legged stool. We need strong laws with strong enforcement. We need a strong labor movement, and we need employers who are going to do the right thing. Because no matter how much we have those first two, employers are going to slip through the cracks, and we can't please every employer. And so one of the things that's critical is developing an environment that stresses civility. There's no reason not to have civility in the workplace, at least that expectation. You know, yeah, there's going to be conflict, but guess what? There are ways to manage conflict in a civil way. In fact, those are the best ways to manage conflict. There are going to be disagreements. In fact, we want disagreements in the workplace around tasks, because that's how we accomplish the tasks the best way. But personal conflict is damaging. It's damaging to the individuals and damaging to organizations. We need to motivate workers, right? But we have decades now of research that say the way to motivate workers has nothing to do with command and control. In fact, it's ineffective. You know, Colin Powell wrote a great article about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, that talked about, look, we need to change our whole thinking in the military, right? This is a general. This is the biggest, you know, guy in the military. And he says, this idea of command and control is just detrimental. This is what causes things like all of the distress that soldiers face, right? And that carries over into their homes, with abuse in their homes. And, you know, and his point was, we shouldn't see this from our armed forces. And so there are better ways. There are better ways to manage people. There are better ways to motivate individuals. And we need to make those systemic within organizations. Our stories need to be focused around respect, not disrespect or intimidation. Our signs and symbols in the workplace. And I'm a big believer in visual signs and perceptions, and this is why today I'm a little bit informal, because I wanted to, you know, have my shirt here as sort of that sign, right? We're talking about dignity in the workplace and not willing to die for work. And when we say that, this is one of our hashtags at the National Workplace Bullying Coalition, we're literally talking about people who die because of bullying in the workplace in all kinds of different ways. And so culture is critical. It's critical because you have to have a negative culture as an antecedent to workplace bullying. If you don't, it won't occur. But it's also critical because to solve it, you have to have a positive culture that's based upon humanistic management, that no matter what we want to say, the humanistic management studies have been proven right. So, it's not just sort of like, we're doing this because, to use a term, we're tree huggers, right? Or, anything like that. It's also good for organizations. And so culture is critical. Culture is critical. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we talk about the process of workplace bullying. So definitions are good, right? But definitions don't always give us everything that we need. So some of the things that I saw in my research in workplace bullying, and that I've seen some specific examples, schoolyard type bullying exists, physical threats in the workplace. It can be shocking what we see. In a university setting, I had a mid-level administrator who shared a story of me, another mid-level administrator yelling at her down a hallway, chasing her into her office, away from the bully's office, in a hallway where there are all kinds of students, other administrators present, and she's just yelling at her the whole way until she got to her office. And these things occur, right? And it might seem shocking. Another individual at a university mentioned that she brought an apple into lunch, and she was in her cubicle, and she put the apple on top of her cubicle throughout the day. And at one point in the day, decided to eat it, grabbed it, went to bite it, and someone had taken a bite out of it and put it back on her cubicle. Right? And she had been a target of all kinds of other bullying in the workplace as well. Screaming in public, that same thing. Unfair, unreasonable work assignments, impossible tasks. This is another way that people engage in bullying. Again, these task-oriented bullying, forms of bullying becoming more and more common, taking credit for the work of others, removal from meaningful work. And this isn't really about, sometimes we all have to do things at work that we don't want to do, and we should pitch in to help out others. We're talking about consistent removal of the meaningful parts of our jobs. Seat checks. Had a number of individuals who shared stories with me that, that they would, at 8 o'clock, they knew their manager was coming around and looking to see that they're all in their seats with no excuses. If you're not in your seat, something is wrong with you. One of the organizations I worked in, our general manager, for one reason or another, spent his lunchtime looking out his window, looking at the parking lot. And he would spend this time earlier than the lunch hour and beyond the lunch hour, because he would come to me and say, well, this person left 5 minutes early for lunch, or this person came in 5 minutes late. What are we going to do about it? And, one of my favorite incidents that occurred is we had an engineer who was our #1 patent producer in that organization, which was a critical part of that organization. And he came to me and he said, I've seen her leave an hour early for lunch. And I've seen her come in an hour late for lunch. What are we going to do about this? And my response was, well, probably nothing, because she's achieving everything we want in this organization. I'm not sure what the huge issue is here. He wasn't very receptive to that. And as a result of that, in a few weeks' time, she was gone from the organization, and the organization suffered. Going through one's work, micromanaging. Other example that we see, pulling support with no explanation, use of policies to bully. And again, some examples of this, especially performance management policies, assignment policies, work office policies, stealing of lunches and practical jokes. And a big one that we see is isolation, ostracizing, and the cold shoulder, isolating targets so that they believe that they're the problem, not the bully. The NAQ is an operational method of determining whether or not individuals have been bullied. And the NAQ, the initial one, has 40 some items that have been identified to be workplace bullying. I'm not going to go through all of these, but they're all on the slides. Just going to mention a few of them. Withholding information it has become a very common form of workplace bullying. Being humiliated or ridiculed, you see the sexual attention there, the sexual harassment. Work below your level of competence, talked about that earlier. Key areas of responsibility removed or replaced with trivial or unpleasant tasks. Spreading of gossip, being ignored. One of the things that you'll see with this instrument is we begin to see two types of workplace bullying. We see interpersonal type of bullying, relationship type of bullying, and we see task type of bullying. So, interpersonal would be having insulting or offensive remarks made about your person, or being shouted at, or intimidating behaviors. And then we get into sort of a more task one, hints or signals from others that you should quit your job. Repeated reminders of your errors or mistakes. And again, this isn't just, we're not talking about just correcting someone, right? We're not just talking about pointing out to someone, that they should have done something a bit differently. We're not talking about training or coaching. We're talking about repeated reminders of this, and not to correct, but to sort of drill it in that you've messed up. Persistent criticism of your work and effort. Again, that persistent criticism. Having your opinions and views ignored. One of the targets I talked to in my initial research on workplace bullying shared with me that, she would come into her department meetings, she would share an idea, and there would be silence. And then sometimes 20 minutes later in the department meeting, someone would share the exact same idea, sometimes word for word, and then all of a sudden everyone's like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, let's adopt that. And this was a regular occurrence for her. So we see that, and there, can I prove that they intended to bully her? Could she prove? Probably not, but I know the effect that it had on her. And she mentioned that effect and how it carried over into her home and her life outside of work. Some others, being given tasks with unreasonable or impossible targets or deadlines, having unfounded allegations made against you, excessive monitoring, pressure not to claim something by which you are entitled to. One of the major ways that I've seen this occur is especially with work teams. When you have work teams and self-managed work teams, there's oftentimes this pressure to do things like not take family medical leave if you're entitled to it, not take your paid time off even though you're entitled to it. So this has become an increasing problem. Being the subject of excessive teasing and sarcasm, threats of making your life difficult, that unmanageable workload again, and being moved or transferred against your will. Again, because I do a lot of this work in K-12, that last one I see a lot. A teacher brings a complaint one year, whether that be a safety complaint or a complaint about harassment or any other legitimate complaint, and the next year they find themselves in a classroom where they have no background to teach, and it's not in their field. Even moving teachers from middle school to kindergarten as an example, which is a much different skill set that you need for those two, and almost always as a sort of form of hidden punishment to them. And so the important thing here in looking at the different elements is I want you to understand that workplace bullying takes different forms. Yes, we see the relationship type of bullying, that typical sort of bullying that might carry over from childhood schoolyard bullying, but we also see this growing level of task bullying. And if I were really to divide this based upon the studies that we see of bullying in the workplace today, task is really the majority of the forms of bullying. So relationship, maybe we're talking about a 60-40 or anywhere from there to a 70-30 split. This task bullying is becoming more and more common. And as Amy mentioned, I talk about the NAQ with my students, and one of my concerns is that I've done some research, and I hope to publish it soon, where I ask students about these elements of the NAQ and whether or not they think they're workplace bullying. And what I'm finding is more and more students are claiming that the task bullying is not. And their response is, I then ask the qualitative question: for anything you indicated not to be bullying, explain why. For anything that you indicated to be bullying, explain why. Two different qualitative questions. And what I find with the task is this response of, well, that's just part of work. And that's what we should expect from work. And that's problematic that this would become a norm. And I'm going to explain why that's really, really problematic. So, but before I do, again, this is sort of a stopping point. This is that second bullet point of discussing identifying workplace bullying. Any questions about the types of workplace bullying that we see? Okay, so if not, we'll move on to talking about who bullies. First of all, in this varies. It's interesting in the United States. Well, maybe not all that interesting because it's probably what most would expect. What we see is supervisors are the most common bullies in the U.S. So it's that position power, that formal power that's typically used. But what we also see is that peers and subordinates can also be workplace bullies. The key is that there has to be a source of power, and that power can be formal, like we see with supervisors, or informal. Some examples of sources of power include position power, include referent power. People respect that individual, so they get away with a lot. Information power, people who have the information that you need for work. One of the targets of workplace bullying in my research was a financial advisor, and the administrative assistant in the office held the majority of information that all the advisors needed, and she would use that to bully and sort of picked him out to be the one that she bullied the most. He was young, he was new to the field, and for one reason or another, he sort of got picked out, and she would withhold information that he needed on a regular basis, and make him look bad to his boss, make him look bad with the clients. So that information power, relational power. This is the individual in the workforce that has a connection with those in formal positions of power. Coercive power is another one. Even mobbing power can be one. The only part I'm hesitant about mobbing power is I don't want to confuse mobbing with organizing. Right? So we make a clear distinction that organizing and engaging in concerted activity as employees to get better wages, terms, and conditions of employment, that's not bullying. Right? That is, in fact, workers trying to equalize power with members of management. But when we talk about groups of workers coming together to harass and engage in objectionable, unwanted behavior against another worker, that is bullying. Okay. And there's all of these different sources of power, and any one of these can be an antecedent to workplace bullying. And we're going to talk about the process in a bit too, but I want to talk about the effects of bullying next. And this is why it's so important. So according to Irenerson, workplace bullying may be a more crippling and devastating problem for employees than all other work-related stress put together, right? And so what that tells us is this should be our priority. Everything about the workplace, this should be our number one priority, addressing workplace bullying. This is the greatest source of stress. We've seen studies recently that say if you work 55 hours or more per week, you are literally killing yourself. You're literally working yourself to death. That's critical, right? But what we see is workplace bullying might even be more critical than that. We see a lot of research out there right now that says the minimum wage and even $15 an hour is not a living wage in any community across the country. That's critical. And we should be addressing that, but we should also be addressing this. Targets of bullying suffer severe negative outcomes, including stress, illness, and even death. One of the first places I worked, we had an individual, a female worker on second shift, and we didn't do our job in having any real good control over our second shift. It was sort of a skeleton crew in a huge facility with only a couple of areas that were running, but she was severely bullied into all kinds of things by male coworkers on that second shift. And about 2 months into the job, I had met her because I wandered around, both first shift and second shift as much as I could. But again, wasn't there the whole second shift, and really nobody in the office area was. About 2 months in, was informed that she went home and killed herself. And, there wasn't anything that indicated this was a result of workplace bullying, but looking back at the things that had occurred to her in the workplace and that we had complaints about, really strong possibility that it was linked to that, or at least played a contributing role. I work with the Badass Teachers Association, and one of the reasons that they are so interested in workplace bullying, there have been a number of teachers who have committed suicide as a result of workplace bullying. One of them several years ago, you might remember, actually went into the bathroom in the school building and committed suicide during the school day. Just recently, and this one really has hit home to me because I have, well, my daughters are a little bit older, and so they're in their full careers, but I have younger sons, and we've seen a couple of stories of parents reporting about their sons who were bullied to death, bullied at workplaces and committed suicide. And this is terrible. These parents sent out these young kids, and both of the boys were around 19 or 20, but they sent them out into the workplace thinking that they're going to gain these valuable tools, right? And these valuable experiences. And instead what they got is they got bullied, and it led to the end of their lives. And so the effects are just devastating. Fahey and Devine, and one of the interesting things about Fahey and Devine's study, they found that 98% of teachers were targets of workplace bullying, and they found that those targets suffered psychological, economic, physical, and social outcomes, including stress, suicide ideation, hypervigilism, and loss of esteem. So the effects on targets are tremendous, ranging from that loss of esteem to fear and resentment. That hypervigilism I need to stress, because one of the things I've seen working with unions is they mistake anxiousness, nervousness, hypervigilism that's a result of workplace bullying with some kind of mental deficiency or issue or neurosis that they target to the individual, or they believe is the individual's issue rather than the organization's issue. So workplace bullying affects people quickly, and they behave differently. And we need to recognize that, and we need to look at the result, look at the cause, the true cause of what's going on. Crying, distress, depression, suicide ideation. Violence. An FBI study, and I haven't seen one done since this, but it was about 13, 14 years ago, said that the vast majority, if not all, of workplace violence can be traced back to bullying in the workplace. It's a huge finding. Addiction, overuse of substances. And one of the things that we see is these effects and targets are oftentimes an escalation of effects. So what the message is, if we can deal with this early, ideally we want to prevent, right? But if we're going to detect and remedy, we need to do it early before we see the worst of these outcomes, before we see the irreparable outcomes take place. Physical effects that we see: high blood pressure, heart disease, hair loss, nervous tics, alcohol, drug use, overuse, abuse, and even addiction. One of my clients who came into my law office, who I wasn't able to fully help, again, because of not being able to show that this was status-based harassment, but I was able to help at least through the unemployment compensation process, because in addition to bullying this individual at work, her employer had the nerve to then deny unemployment compensation. So I was able to help her with that unemployment compensation, but the reality was she suffered a great deal of damage, constant shaking as a result of her bullying. She couldn't keep her hands steady on a number of different prescription drugs as a result of the workplace bullying. So these are things that we want to prevent, we want to avoid, we need to address early. Economic effects: absenteeism, increased healthcare costs, job loss. And then think about what job loss leads to. right? It's one of the things I always ask my students when we're talking about organizing, because typically that internal employee who tries to organize a union, they're going to get fired. And so I ask my students, what happens when an individual is fired? Well, they can't pay their rent, they can't pay their mortgage, right? And so they get foreclosed on or they get evicted, right? And I, adding some humor to it, tell them, they end up in a van down by the river, as Chris Farley said famously on Saturday Night Live, many years ago. And that's the reality. We see these effects, and they're devastating, and we should be looking to prevent them. Effects on families, right? Bullying at home. So many targets have told me that they become a different person at home as a result of the workplace bullying than what they were before. This goes right back to Colin Powell's recognition of this in the military, right? Saying we need to change things because this is spilling over into other places and it shouldn't, right? And that's without even doing any research on it. The research backs up that statement. We see this spillover. Broken relationships as a result. People become isolated and exclude themselves from things. So we have this loss of spousal and parental consortium as well. Diminished interest in relationships for targets that affect families. So all kinds of groups are affected. Bystanders. We know that people who see bullying in the workplace, have a lot of these same effects that targets have. In addition to that, we see lost confidence, lost commitment to the employer, unwillingness to report. Think about it. If you see someone being bullied in your workplace and nothing's being done about it, and then you become a target, why would you report it? There are legitimate reasons why people don't report these, whether it's unlawful harassment or just workplace bullying. One of the best pieces of testimony that I believe came forward while we were engaged in the task force at the EEOC was from Dr. Bergman. And she said that, look, it is the rational person, not the irrational person, who doesn't report harassment in the workplace. Because when you report, the greatest possibility is a negative outcome. And that greatest negative outcome is most likely going to be loss of your job. The least likely possibility is the harassment might end, but there's a very small chance of that. So why would people report it? And with bystanders, that of course becomes a common concern. Bystanders also experience that anxiety, that fear, and that nervousness when they see this occurring in the workplace. One of the best statements that I've heard about workplace bullying comes from that Badass Teachers Association. And they use this term all the time. A teacher's working conditions or a child's learning conditions, right? So that spillover to children in the workplace. When we talk about bullying in K-12, by the way, according to Badass Teachers Association surveys, we're seeing well above a 40% rate of teachers who are bullied in the workplace. When we talk about higher ed, where you think, well, maybe people would be above this, according to Leah Hollis, about 58% of higher ed employees are targets of workplace bullying. So we have these areas where we see really high rates. But this idea of a teacher's working conditions or a child's learning conditions, it's the same for all employment. This spills over to the people that we are serving, to the organization that we're serving. We see bad quality products where we have workplace bullying. We see lots of scrap where we have workplace bullying. We see bad exchanges between workers and their customers or their clients or their communities where we have workplace bullying. We've even seen disasters and medical mistakes. There are stories of nurses who said, yeah, I knew that he was making a medical error, but he was a bullying doctor, so I kept my mouth shut. And patients suffer. There's a study from, I'm forgetting the researcher now, but they mention an airline disaster that the black box indicates that the co-pilot was unwilling to question what the pilot was doing because the pilot was a bully. And the airline crashed, the airplane crashed. Disasters. Effects on communities. of course, again, back to this unemployment we see that's bad for communities. Foreclosures and evictions are bad for communities. Withdraw from community by targets, right? I mean, we see a lot of this. We see all kinds of reasons for lack of community involvement, right? Back to that 55 hours a week, back to that having to work multiple jobs to just get by. But we see targets that withdraw. And so they no longer are active community members. We see bystanders that withdraw. We see families that withdraw. And then we see this link between bullying and poverty and homelessness. Nobody benefits from workplace bullying. And so there's no reason not to eliminate it. Okay, so yeah, organization. So almost skip this because to me, this is probably the least important part, right? My concern is about human rights and dignity in the workplace, but the effects on organizations, why this is important to me, is because it makes no sense to me why organizations don't do more. We know that in the US, billions of dollars are lost each year as a result of workplace bullying. We know that a single incident of workplace bullying can cost as much as $2 million to an organization when we look at all direct and indirect costs. We know that workplace bullying leads to absenteeism. And I can tell you from my experiences as an HR manager and now as a faculty member in a business school where I teach a lot of supervisors and managers, their biggest complaint's always absenteeism. Well, guess what? Here's something that you can do that helps to reduce absenteeism, get rid of workplace bullying, turnover, reputational costs, increased healthcare costs, safety issues at work, scrap, wasted products, low quality products, accidents, lawsuits, lost innovations, and decreased organizational citizenship behaviors. All of these are linked to workplace bullying. All negative outcomes for organizations. There is no benefit to it. They should be taking steps to eliminate it, yet what we see is they are not. Okay, so before I move on to the process, any questions about the effects?
I don't, Jerry, just people had a lot of, affirming comments in the chat about their experiences with this.
Great.
It certainly strikes me like, why aren't we doing something then? It's so clear that it's so super harmful, yet story after story, people knew all the harm and they really dug in instead of eliminating the problem. And it's really hard to see why they would, I guess, because they're not having any consequences either direction.
Right. Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think it's one we need to study further by talking to bullies. But from my research on organizations, one of the things that I see is there's this latching on to control. And that is really part of the American US employment history, is this idea of control, right? And having to exert control. We're 40 years out from McGregor's studies of theory X and theory Y. Actually might be closer to 60 years out now that I think about it, right? Where we know that theory X forms of management and supervision are detrimental, command and control supervision. Yet what we see is the vast majority of American supervisors still adopt command and control. And maybe this goes back to our whole foundation of the American employment system, which comes from Wood's treatise, written in the 1860s. And he was saying this is the system of employment law in the United States because it's adopted from the English common law. And he really lied throughout the rest of the treatise, saying that it's employment at will. Well, that's not what English common law was. English common law was just cause and employment for term. And what's even worse is the name of that treatise isn't actually Wood's treatise. The name of that treatise is Master and Servant. And I think that lays out this foundation, right? And then we sort of build from that, this idea that employers have this right to exert this control, and so we shouldn't limit it. Too oftentimes I see people who are supposed activists for targets of workplace bullying that say, well, we've got to make the Chamber of Commerce happy. We're not going to make the Chamber of Commerce happy here. It's not going to happen. We're not going to make SHRM happy here. I've yet to see SHRM support any pro-employee legislation. They oppose the Family Medical Leave Act, which is unpaid leave, right? I mean, it's not even a meaningful right. So you know, we've got to get out of that idea that employers have to have this control in the workplace. Another one of my dissertation committee's members, James Gross, did a lot of work, and it was great work talking about, the biggest mistake of the labor movement was just saying, yeah, management rights, those belong to the company. We're not going to negotiate those. And so we have this precedent set that, you have the right to management and we're just sort of below you, right? And instead of, we're all human beings, so we're all equal. Right, we all should be here. Just because you're in charge of human resources or accounting or even the CEO doesn't mean you're here. And we see it sort of today too, I think, right? I mean, people applauding a certain individual taking off into space today. So, so I think, because he's a CEO and that's not equality, and we need to drive for equality.
I know sort of in the mental health education literature theory, we think that bullies are people. Usually I think about it like, wow, that kid is getting bullied in their home. Like they're learning this from their parents. This is happening in their home. And now they feel so powerless. They can't wait to come someplace and have power and control. Do you feel like that plays out in the adult work world as well, that these are kids that were horribly treated and now they have power and they just can't wait to exert it?
Yeah, I think there is some of that. I think there's some of that. I think we also see bullies as kids grow up to be bullies in the workplace if they're not checked there. But I think there's more than that too, because one of the things is we see that bullies come from all walks of life. Some bullies, again, sometimes it's mistaken bullying, right? Sometimes it is their pressure was so intense that they became a bully. One of the targets I talked to, in fact, was a chair of a department. And she really should have been a dean of a college, but her department was just never listed as a college because she was in charge of it. So the president always kept it as a department rather than a college. And she was just bullied constantly by this president of the university. And then she started bullying the assistant chair. And then she started bullying faculty, right? And it wasn't until she talked to me during the research that she's like, wow, I became what I so opposed, right? Because of the bullying in the workplace. So correcting her behavior is a lot different than correcting that president's behavior who really just wanted to bully. So we see it come from all different walks of life. Linking childhood bullying to adult bullying has not been studied nearly enough. And it's actually one I've been frustrated with because I have reached out to numerous researchers in childhood bullying, asking them to partner with me on that research, because there's all kinds of things, as you know, when you're studying children, like IRB issues, you have to have a completely different way of phrasing questions or even observations. I don't know, so I can't do that research, but I've looked for people to link. So if anyone's out there interested in linking to see the connections, please let me know, and I would love to conduct some research on that. Yeah, excellent. So the why we're going to talk about. This is a process now I'm going to talk about. And what we see is there have to be some antecedents at 3 levels. Organizations have to allow bullying or even promote bullying in order for it to occur. Bullies have to have a source of power as well as a willingness or desire to bully. And then the system itself, our overall culture, plays a big role as an antecedent. One of the things I always point out to people is think about the ways that we support bullying on a daily basis. And we support it in a broad basis. Well, one, we do it by saying things like, well, that's just the way work is. We have a placement office here on campus where I oftentimes just have to sort of grit my teeth. Those placement directors will come in and they'll tell students, you should just be happy to have a job. Well, that sets a terrible precedent. That says that your employer can do whatever they want to you. That's a terrible way to approach our culture. And then the other thing that I point out, and I point this out in my book, even pre-2016, is think about some of the TV shows, right? We had an individual who we glorified who would end his TV show every week with "you're fired," right? That's a terrible terrible thing to do, isn't it? I mean, you're fired shouldn't be something we celebrate. You're fired should be something that, it's like a last thing that we want to do. But then we continue those, right? We have a show called Hell's Kitchen, where we glorify an individual who abuses these individuals who maybe they've signed up for the abuse, but it's also sort of like this suggestion this should occur in the workplace, right? And we have all kinds of examples of like that in our media and in our culture, and so those things allow for bullying to occur. I have detailed slides on all of these, but I just really want to talk about this is the process that I saw and that I have seen with targets of bullying. We have these antecedents, and then bullying occurs, and then we have the effects of bullying, especially in terms of affect, right? So people may not cognitively be aware that they've been targets, but they feel it and they're suffering the outcomes anyways, and then they react to it. And we see these reactions: withdrawal, turnover, absenteeism, lower satisfaction, loss of esteem. For instance, I had one target of workplace bullying who said to me, I've been in this organization being bullied for 5 years because why would anybody hire me elsewhere? I'm not worthy of being hired. Complete loss of esteem, had not even identified herself as a target of workplace bullying until the research. And so we have all of these effects before people even gain consciousness, either as individual targets or seeing that they're not alone. One of the things, no matter what, that I want to stress today is if you are a target of workplace bullying, you are far from being alone. Millions of people today are in the workplace right now being bullied. Millions of Americans today are being bullied. You're not alone. And what we need to do is we need to collectively come together to put an end to it. It's once that consciousness occurs individually, individuals look to attempt to change. And what we see is when they work individually, they tend to go a number of routes. Alternative dispute resolution systems, if they're offered in their workplace, HR policies, bullying back, internalizing and blaming themselves, or exiting. What we see is none of those are good outcomes. None of those work. Those internal systems do not work. Bullying back does not work. Internalizing does not work. And so what I hope to see is a class consciousness, because it's through class consciousness that we can really change this. And we can change it in a number of ways. Concerted activity in the workplace, but also a movement outside of the workplace to say that these types of incidents have to end. So again, just looking at this in more detail, those antecedents, some organizational structures: absent leadership, lack of accountability for direct reports, ignoring risk factors, poor work organization. All those are things that allow for bullying. Leaders need to be present. Leaders should focus on their role as being empowering individuals. That's what your job is. It's no longer doing things. It's creating an environment where others can do things. Ignoring risk factors. What we see is, for instance, if you have decentralized workplaces, we know that decentralized workplaces are more likely to have workplace bullying. If you have heroes in the workplace, those upper level managers that are made out to be heroes, you're more likely to have workplace bullying and harassment. If you have underrepresented groups in a job, they're more likely to be bullied. One of the organizations I worked for, we had 20 some supervisors. One was female, and she suffered so greatly at the hands of the other supervisors. And it wasn't sexualized harassment, it was gender-based harassment. It was, well, why is she in this position? Or she can't do this, or she shouldn't be doing this, or, we're the ones who know what we're doing. It's those types of things. And so you have to pay attention to risk factors. Supporting bullying culture. This is where we get back to. If you have a bullying culture at the top, you're going to have a bullying culture throughout. If you support Theory X management, you're going to have a bullying culture. If you support management by intimidation, you're going to have a bullying culture. One of the organizations I do feel like I was able to make a difference as an HR manager, one of the supervisors was literally hired well before I got there because he got into a fist fight on the floor with a coworker. At that time, he was a member of the shop floor, member of the union, and he won the fist fight. And so management said, man, if he can beat that guy up, he can control our workers. And so they made him a supervisor. That set the tone for bullying throughout that organization. Promoting bullies, worst thing that you can do. This is why part of that performance management system should be looking at, did that individual do the right thing in their workplace, the right thing with their workers? Let's hear from those workers. Hyper competitiveness, work environment leads to workplace bullying. So as I've said, bullying then takes many forms. We've looked at all of these, the interpersonal relationships, as well as the organizational task type bullying. And then we see the effects. And what I want to stress here is we see these effects even before oftentimes targets identify themselves as targets. You know, they won't say that I've been bullied, but we will see these things: loss of esteem, confidence, dignity, the anxiety and nervousness. You know, we'll see that from targets before they even know, before they can even identify, look, someone's doing something wrong to me. We see depression and hypervigilism, all of those things that have these outcomes to behavior of these individuals, and it can oftentimes be confused for other problems. And then we see the reactions as a result: psychological or physical withdrawal, absenteeism, lowered commitment, and so on. And it's not until after that that we oftentimes see consciousness. And this consciousness oftentimes needs a triggering event. Sometimes it's a friend or family member or coworker who informs the target, hey, you're being targeted. This isn't right. This isn't fair. This shouldn't be happening to you. So as coworkers, I believe there's some moral responsibility when you see a coworker being bullied that you at least let them know that this is occurring. And that can be critical to just raise their own consciousness, right? So that they know this isn't them, that it's something bigger. When I engaged in my research, for instance, the surveys that I first sent out, which was sort of an NAQ type of survey saying, have these things occurred to you? And then at the end said, this is the definition of workplace bullying. Have you been bullied? Oftentimes that was the triggering event, right? But we can't survey every single worker in the United States to bring that consciousness about. So we need other ways to bring the consciousness about. Hearing and seeing stories of other individuals helps to bring that consciousness about. These types of events, my hope is this brings that consciousness about as well. So people identify, look, it's not me. It's I'm being bullied by someone else, and it's their problem, not mine. I shouldn't feel like this is my fault. I should be pushing that this behavior should stop. And again, this level of consciousness, whether we see this as an individual problem, which is problematic, or a collective problem, determines the steps that we take. You know, it's a collective steps that can be more effective, the concerted activity, the organizing, really the movement that we need to end this. Just to give you an example of that movement, in the United Kingdom, probably about 15 years ago, there was a movement for the Dignity at Work Act there. And that movement, that never got passed. But one of the things that happened is there's a broad social movement that said dignity should be a right at work. And that became adopted. And as a result of that, employer practices changed. The unions changed in the UK to negotiate dignity clauses into contracts, and the common law changed. Courts all of a sudden were recognizing that bullying was a tort, that it was a personal injury action that people were allowed to bring, and they could sue their employers for it. And so a common law approach emerged, and we need to see something like that in the United States. So that brings us to the last section, solutions. And so before I get there, I just again wanted to touch base and see if there are any questions that go to other things other than solutions, because that will be the last section. All good? All right, so let's move on. So I'm going to talk about solutions at 3 levels. As I've said, I see this as a social issue. I see this as a justice issue. I'm a critical management studies person, which means that I look at the broad societal effects. My field also comes out of critical legal studies. So if you've been paying attention to critical race theory, for instance, you see that that comes out of critical legal studies. And really, it just means that we're looking at the broad picture, right? These organizational effects, these broad effects, societal effects, and how they perpetuate these problems. So that's my bent. I come from the macro level. And so I believe that macro level solutions are absolutely needed. But I'm also going to talk about the meso level and the micro level as well. When we talk about workplace stress, this is the typical sort of thing, sort of the flow that we see or the process that we see. There's workplace stress, and that has a negative effect on quality of life and quality of work life. But one of the things that intervenes is social support. And what social support does is it decreases that effect of workplace stress, right? So it's a negative moderator of workplace stress. It brings down the effect of it. Unfortunately, when we look at workplace bullying, at least to date, what we have found is that social support does not have that effect. So in other words, social support does not solve this issue. It has still this direct link to increased or decreased quality of life and quality of work life. Still, with that, when I talk about the micro level, there are some things that targets can do to address the problem. One, recognize it early, right? Identify that this is going on, because the longer it goes on, the more irreparable the damage is. And so you want to address it early. I'm going to talk about some coping mechanisms. I'm not going to give you a lot of hope with coping mechanisms, but I'm at least going to show you what the research says. We've recently conducted some studies on success stories, asking targets to explain how they view their bullying stories as success stories. And what we've come up with is 4 ways that they identify success. One is winning, filing complaints or claims. There's some of that. You need, some of these were because they had strong union representation that fought for them in the grievance process. At the same time, the majority of targets I talked to don't have union leaders who take up for them. Instead, they question the targets, and that's problematic. Some of these were also claims that went through the law because they linked them to a protected status. If you are a target of bullying, one of the things I always recommend to you from a legal standpoint is try to see how you might be able to link that to a protected status: race, color, national origin, gender, age status over 40, disability, or religion. If you can link it there, write that down, document it, and then take it to an attorney and say, this is how this is harassment, unlawful harassment as well. Okay, and so you might be able to get a win there. Other wins were, people said I won by quitting. And that can be sometimes. We'll talk about the double-edged sword of that in a second too. Growth was a big one. Spiritual, emotional, or professional growth. This growth always took place outside of the employer where the bullying occurred. Okay, so it was exit and then growth. Problematic. Survival. Some people said it was success because it was survival. I suffered the bullying, but I kept my job, and that kept a roof over my head or my family's head. And that's great, but I'm not so sure that's a success. Leaving was very common, viewed as a success. Leaving, and for some it was leaving on my own terms. Some said, hey, I wrote a note, telling them what I thought, and left. We've seen this recently. We saw it at Burger King. I don't know if any of you saw the story the other day, but all 9 workers at Burger King walked out on the same day and quit. So we're not dealing with this anymore. And they actually put on the little sign out in front of the store that they all quit because they were being abused at work. Thought that was great, right? And they probably see that as a success. At the same time, double-edged sword, right? Now you're out of work. And in the United States, that's devastating, right? We have no meaningful social safety net in the United States. And so, this success of leaving, maybe for some, but for others, not so much. At the same time, one of the pieces of advice I always give is know when to get out. You know, at some point, that health harming effect becomes more important than anything else, because too often this story leads to disaster. The end of this story, as the researchers mentioned earlier, oftentimes is death. And I don't want to see that for any target. Pursue legal routes if at all possible. And in order to do that, you've got to document, document, document. Everything that occurs, keep a diary, document it. Any evidence that you have of it, keep that. Any emails that you get, not only keep those emails, but download those. Do not keep those on your employer server. They will get rid of them. Guarantee that. As an attorney, I can tell you, they are going to clean everything they can. They will scrub, scrub, scrub. So any information that you have, secure it, document it, keep it. Jump through hoops. This is what I mentioned here is when we talk about workplace harassment, courts are going to oftentimes require that you show that you went through every step that your employer provided. You're not jumping through the hoops because you think your employer is going to do something to make it better, because in most cases they're not. You're jumping through hoops to secure your legal claim down the road. Worst thing that can happen, you have a really strong case. You're able to show that this is unlawful harassment as well as workplace bullying. It's related to this protected class. Then you get into court and the other party files a motion to dismiss, which they always do. And part of that motion says, this plaintiff failed to go through the employer steps, and the judge says, case dismissed. You don't want that to happen. Jump through those employer hoops. Go through their policy, even if it seems like the policy is stupid, even if the policy says sign X, Y, and Z forms, do it. Do it to protect your legal claim. What do we see in the research? This is Lutkin, Sandvik's research. Escape, we just mentioned that, leaving, double-edged sword, because oftentimes the bully views that as success. Oftentimes that was the bully's whole goal, get you out of the workplace, right? So you're getting away, you might view it as success, but the problem is it's also success on the other side, and you know others are going to suffer as a result. Collective voice, you know, I've mentioned this, coming together in the workplace. Two problems with this. Most often that collective voice is mobbing rather than helping the targets. You know, bystanders are more likely to become part of the mob than they are upstanders. It's unfortunate. The other thing is supervisors tend to ignore it or discount it, even if it's a number of workers coming together, and then they reframe the targets as being deviant, is what the research finds. Subversive disobedience, work to rule, withholding labor. Again, unfortunately, this oftentimes in organizations just gets reframed as production deficits, and that often leads to discipline, including termination. Okay, I am all for working to rule. I believe that we should work to rule every day. That's what we've agreed to do, right? That's the exchange. We've said, this is the job I'm agreeing to. This is what you're agreeing to pay me. We should always be working to that rule, because when we work over, it's not like the employer is saying, okay, now I'm giving you more, right? That doesn't happen. So we should always work to rule. But unfortunately, what we see in the bullying environment, when an individual works to rule as response, it just gets turned on them and they become disciplined in the workplace. Even worse, viewing it as late stage conflict and trying to engage in conflict management. What we see is that targets apply a variety of active and passive conflict management strategies, and these do not prove successful. They most commonly still lead to exit. So what we see in the Zapf and Gross is there are all these different patterns of how this plays out, but the end is always the same. The end is exit. And a lot of bad things happen before that exit as a result of this. What they do find is successful targets are actually engaged in direct strategies less often than unsuccessful. What that means is the successful just try to de-escalate, ignore, or concede to the bully. You know, in other words, I'm not going to try to end it. I'm just going to try to ignore it, de-escalate, and move on. Unfortunately, that rarely stops the bully. What we see is with unsuccessful conflict management, it often leads to these other bad outcomes. One of the main ones pointed out by Zapf and Gross, overuse and abuse of substances. And so not a good outcome in terms of trying to deal with it from a conflict management standpoint. Coping is not much better. Direct active modes of coping do not offer the same level of protection of targets as they do with other social stressors, according to Rickman, Respenda, and Flaherty and Fields. This is, again, that model that I pointed out at the beginning. These coping mechanisms just don't seem to work. Direct active coping did not end the bullying. It just continues. And taking direct action, again, same sort of finding as Zapp and Gross, led to alcohol use and abuse. Right? So we see these problems because of this frustration of these individual mechanisms not working. So it brings us to what can others do? Well, again, witnesses recognize it. Witnesses become an upstander, not a mobber. Intervene, deflect, pull targets away from the situation or the bully. One of the things I would stress here is make sure that whatever actions you take, the target is comfortable with those. That's a big part of being an upstander. Okay, but it's oftentimes the idea of just becoming that person that intervenes. Change the topic when you see it happening with the bully, and then go back to the target later on and say, hey, I saw this happening. What are your thoughts? This is why I intervene. Do you need help? Do you need assistance? Is there something that I can do? Okay, we need upstanders in the workplace. It's, without that, this is never going to be fully addressed. Supporters, families, advocates, counselors, and attorneys all play a role. Social support, as I said, great moderator of workplace stress, hasn't been so much for targets of bullying, but families need to recognize it. I've heard too many stories where targets have said, I went home, I told my spouse what was happening, and they said that, it was my fault, or I was the problem, or they didn't believe me. Believe them, this happens, it's so common, right? Advocates, we need to do what we can to eliminate this. We need people to become advocates. We need more advocates. The only way this is going to end, the only way we're going to get legislation is through a movement. All strong employment laws have come through a movement. If we look back through the history, the one thing I can sort of say is the one employment law that I didn't really see a huge movement for was the Family Medical Leave Act. And think about what that law provides. We live in a society where the vast majority of workers earn below living wage. And so what you're allowed to do is, if you work for a large employer, you're allowed to take unpaid leave for certain events. It's not a very strong law. But when we look back, Civil Rights Act, strong movement. The Americans with Disabilities Act, strong movement. The National Labor Relations Act, strong movement. The Fair Labor Standards Act, strong movement. We need a movement. The other thing is, I call on my colleagues in the legal field to be more creative. Let's push the boundaries. Let's try to find ways that we can litigate this. Let's try to make common law a path, a route. Don't just turn clients away. Try something. Work with clients to take, a partial representation agreement. So in other words, that you'll help them file their complaint. You'll write their complaint for them, but you won't, so that they can afford it. Work with organizations across the country, give some of that time, that pro bono time, to organizations where you can help targets of this, of workplace bullying. So, but we need everybody working together. Organizations have to be a part of this. What we see when we talk to organizations is very few of them have policies. There's some SHRM research out there that concluded the majority of employers have anti-workplace bullying policies. When individuals dug into that research, what they found is they weren't anti-bullying policies, they were anti-harassment policies, policies required by law. But they never addressed workplace bullying. And those policies that were required by law were ineffective. They didn't even meet the minimal legal standard, the Clark standard, of what those policies should include. So we need stronger policies in workplaces. And we need better HR folks. I teach HR students. It's one of the things I do. HR majors. I teach employment law, I teach labor relations, and I teach business and society. And I try to stress to the HR students, yes, I am against HR. You're going to get that a lot. You're going to hear me say lots of negative things about HR, not because I don't think it's needed, but I think it needs reform. And I want you as students to be the reformers. Make it different. Get these policies in place. Make the change that's needed. Organizations need to, and there's no reason for them not to. because even if we just look at this from a capitalistic standpoint, they make better profit when they get rid of workplace bullying. When we look at some research on what's currently going on, HR, in the words of Harrington, Warren, and Rayner, enact symbolic violence on employees who raise claims of bullying against their managers by attributing managerial bullying behaviors to legitimate performance management practices. This is typically what we see. We also see this symbolic violence because HR is tasked with preventing lawsuits. And so the best way to do that is get rid of the individual who might cause the problems. Cowan says HR viewed reports as misinterpretations of others' behaviors. No excuse for this at this point. We're 40 years into the research on workplace bullying. These are not misinterpretations of behaviors. This is bullying. That's what it is. Unfairly blame targets if they do not have a feeling about the complaint or no outside collaboration. You know, one of the problems with collaboration is we've forgotten what that means, right? Supporting evidence, we've forgotten what that means. We saw that during a hearing for a certain Supreme Court justice, where an individual was testifying about what occurred to her, and people were saying, well, there's no collaborating evidence, meaning that there are no other witnesses saying that we saw that. That's not collaborating evidence. That is a form of it, but that's not all of it. Collaborating evidence includes things like extemporaneous notes. So if you as a target are documenting and you're putting dates on what's occurring, that's collaborating evidence that should be looked at. Collaborating evidence is statements made to others by that individual, you know, other behavior that they've engaged in. All kinds of collaborating evidence that should be explored. And the other problem is, you know, HR looks at their role as strategic partner and a member of management, which they are. We should never forget that. Okay, targets should never forget that HR is a member of management. They are hired by management. They can be fired by management. So you have to keep that in mind. One of the things I always tell individuals, if you're in a car wreck, would you allow the other party to select and pay your attorney? And you wouldn't, right? And so why would you do that with HR? You're not going to allow managers who are bullying you to control your advocate. Doesn't mean that you can't work with them, but it means you have to realize they're really not a true advocate for you. Organizations, what do they need to do? We know this. We know this from the research on harassment. This is all part of the EEOC Select Task Force report for ending workplace harassment. We need strong policies. Those policies have to come from the top. They have to have a true purpose. It means we're looking to eliminate bullying. We're not just looking to make better money. Okay, we have to keep focused on that true purpose. We need prevention training throughout organizations. We need broad reporting mechanisms that everybody's comfortable with. We should see management by wandering around so that supervisors are seeing what's going on in their areas. Workplace audits, you know, making, you know, this should include surveys. We need strong investigation processes. These are pretty simple. You know, can help organizations put together great investigation processes. We need a good remedial process. We need strong anti-retaliation provisions. All organizations need this. We need to focus on culture. Our stories need to be one of respect. Our reward system needs to reward respect and dignity. Our performance management system should reward leaders who are engaged in their employees in a respectful way, that are empowering their employees, not controlling them. Leadership style can play an important moderator role. We need democratic, empowering leadership, not autocratic, controlling leadership. We need unions to play a role. Recognize bullying and the effects. Don't take the other side, right? Understand these are the types of behaviors that you should expect to see from targets. Nervousness, anxiety, those types of things. Become a strong advocate for targets. There should be collective bargaining language that addresses workplace bullying. And WBC, we have that language available, as well as a path of how you get it into your contract. How do you convince the other side? Bylaw language. Nothing upsets me more than seeing union brothers and sisters bullying each other. Address it in your bylaws. Say, we're not going to allow this. If you're going to bully your union brothers and sisters, you're going to be out of the union. Grievances. Bring grievances forward, provide legal representation, engage in other forms of concerted activity to protect members. But one thing that we can't get around is we need a strong law with strong enforcement. To get there, we need a change in culture in our society. We need a focus on the right to dignity in the workplace. We are not going to have a strong law until we have the majority of people recognizing that, or at least a strong movement recognizing that. One of the things that's always surprising is people think when we have a movement, it's the vast majority of the country. The reality is if you get 2 to 5% of people involved in a movement, that's a huge movement. And that can move mountains, much less move our culture. Legislation can be done. 1993, Sweden passed legislation addressing workplace bullying and recognizing that workplace practices can be a form. So they said just because it's a workplace policy doesn't mean it's not bullying. France, social modernization law, 21 years ago, made it not just a civil offense, but a criminal offense. The Quebec law on psychological harassment, one of the keys in Quebec is we have a labor court, and so that gets people, that solves the problem quickly and gets them back into the workplace. So exit is not an answer. We try to keep you in the workplace. Belgium says employers should take all necessary steps. We see countries, Germany, Spain, the UK, that address this through common law. Court saying this is a personal injury claim. We recognize it. Puerto Rico passed strong legislation just this year. We can follow suit. There's no reason we can't. The Dignity at Work Act, just to bring you up to speed, we've had hearings in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We have other states that have legislative sponsors, but the reality is we need a movement. We had incredible testimony. And if these hearings were really going to be the answer to pushing this legislation forward, that would have been the answer. I mean, if you watch it, I'm sure you'll feel the same way I did. It was like, how can we not take a step? And the chair of that committee, bless her for staying around for the hours of testimony that it took, way past time. She was the only one who stood around, but she even said to us at the end, the only way this is going to happen is you've got to contact your own legislators. And the only way your own legislators are going to react to this, from my perspective, is if they fear they're going to lose their jobs if they don't. And the only way that happens is if there's a movement. So I want you contacting your legislators, but I want you having 100 people behind you saying the same thing. Pass this legislation. All right, so just some takeaways. Workplace bullying, severe and pervasive. It's a reality. The effects of bullying are felt by organizations and targets even before the phenomena is identified. Unfortunately, very few good options for targets of bullying and no real legal protections. Now, if we can fit it into unlawful harassment, some legal protections, but all kinds of reasons why those aren't adequate either. The EEOC is not going to take your case, almost positively. They take very, very few. The EEOC has no budget. When I worked on the EEOC Select Task Force, the entire meals and entertainment budget for the entire agency was $2,000 per year. The entire agency. So all these experts came into DC from across the country. We all paid our own airfare and travel. The commissioners brought down their Keurig machine for coffee. The staffers brought in cases of Diet Coke and cases of water throughout the day. And then for lunch, all of us would throw a $20 bill into a basket to pay for the lunch for the day. There's no funding. We got to change that. We got to change the EEOC. We got to give them enforcement power because right now there's not an option. The other way that you address these issues is through litigation. Well, litigation is going to cost a minimum $10,000 to $15,000 for targets. Not too many people can afford that. You're not going to find attorneys to take it on contingency unless you're making six figures because it's not worth it to them. Right? The damages are not enough for the attorneys to make up the case. You might find some, there's never, I should never say never that you're not going to find them, but it's going to be really tough. So access to the courts is extremely limited. And for those who even pursue litigation, at the end of the day, the win rate is 2%. 2%. So really not a lot of good legal options. Workplace bullying, it violates targets' human rights. That should be unacceptable. Right? We signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the main writers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. And here we are still debating this? It's unacceptable. Organizations have an economic and ethical incentive to eliminate workplace bullying, but they're not doing it. Bullying is not an effective management style. No sustainable benefit in the workplace, yet it continues. And we need solutions at all levels, micro, meso, macro. And to me, the most important is that macro level. Okay, well, thank you all for being here. And if you have any questions, definitely.
There's lots of questions. That was so amazing.
Okay.
And so like, wow, thank you. Thank you so much for all the work you've done to really highlight such a huge, I really didn't get the scope of how much harm this is doing at the individual level, at the organizational level, at the societal level. And you really laid it out here. Somebody had a question looking for a little more information about that, the FBI study that you referenced quickly that said something about workplace sort of violence linking back to having been bullied.
Yeah, so that study was, again, it's about 15 years ago. So I would have to get it, I'd probably have to look it up again because that's like probably 6 computers ago, but I do have it somewhere. If you send me an email, drjcarbo@comcast.net, and definitely feel free to share that. I will see if I can dig it up for you because I think it's a crucial study and I'd like to dig it up anyways because it's time to have another one because we've seen other incidents, since then. So
it
definitely
does show how much this could be rippling out, impacting at so many levels when it could have really been something. If we had the legislation, if we had the systems in place and people got satisfaction from their complaints, we wouldn't have so many disgruntled employees, disgruntled with good reason. Also, someone had asked about the social support pieces. I know in general for trauma, social support is the best thing. And it looked like that was really impacted in workplace bullying. And if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so it's unfortunately what we see so far in the research is the social support just isn't making a difference to the end outcomes. But I don't think that means we give up on the end outcomes. To me, I think there's a little bit of a hole there. And I think the hole is that social support is not complete because people question targets of workplace bullying in ways they don't question other forms of stress. So they're less likely to believe. And so I don't, I can't say because I haven't done the studies, and so I'm not questioning their studies. They've concluded those outcomes, and they're very valid studies that say the social support doesn't have the effect. But I think that what we need to do is go beyond what the social support is right now, and that means that people have to believe, step one, the targets are telling the truth, and they maybe have to find further avenues of providing that support. And sometimes that really might be providing an exit path for targets, right? And because that's tough. And sometimes it is, family might need to also be economic support as a form of the social support. But yeah, it's unfortunate that we see that lack of that connection, but I'm not giving up on the social support would be my point.
Well, and if the social support is coming from work at all, you could see how that would be impacted. Many of us, our friends and our workplace are similar. So if you're being isolated, excluded, if people feel like supporting you is going to be negative for them, that would make some sense.
Yes. Yeah. And that is an unfortunate reality. And bullies do tend to bully the upstanders sometimes. There's a risk to being an upstander, but I think, we all have at least some level of moral obligation to at least give it a try.
Also, there had been a question about sort of COVID. And if I know sort of going into this, to advertise, I was looking at the COVID data about how many people left their jobs, how dramatically the workforce shifted. I know Michelle is a lawyer. She had asked about, are you protected at all if you're working from home? What kinds of things have been results of the sort of pandemic learning.
Yeah, so interesting question about being protected if you're working from home. I mean, the general answer is yes, if it becomes your workplace. So it's the same environment. So, the harassment from coworkers can occur over Zoom. There's been some indication that harassment's been worse as a result of Zoom. Maybe this idea that we see like on social media where, you get these nasty messages and of course the comments to news articles that people would probably never say face to face, but Zoom is a little disconnection, so people are more willing to do that. To me, though, the worst part of the pandemic was what employers did. And again, I work a lot in K-12, so that might skew that a bit. But the bullying during the pandemic was ramped up. And at a time when I would have hoped that employers would have come together with workers, just the opposite. And the EEOC even had a roundtable a couple of months ago that looked at this specifically with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the lack of accommodation. And all those who testified said employers were at their worst during this, denying accommodations left and right, violating the ADA. And what's unfortunate is I've yet to see the EEOC say, we need to take steps now to address this. Let's fast track these complaints of ADA violations. They haven't done that. Let's update the ADA enforcement guidance, pandemic enforcement guidance. They haven't done that. OSHA is no longer writing any type of directives for the pandemic, right? They abandoned that, even though that was promised a couple of months ago by the president. So it was atrocious. And the people who were denied accommodations, I had people who were undergoing chemotherapy that were denied accommodations. Pregnancy is not considered a disability under the ADA, but we know that pregnant women were at higher risk of COVID and they were denied accommodations. Now, there's no legal requirement to provide accommodations, but there's clearly a moral one. And so the pandemic to me brought out the worst that I've seen in employers. But I have to be honest, when I look back 25 years ago, I worked in manufacturing for two different employers that were not considered progressive. And their employment practices were much more progressive than what I'm seeing from almost any employer today. I really feel like we've been on a 25-year downward spiral.
Wow. There are plenty of more questions, and I know most people expect that we're going to wrap up by 2. And I don't know, Jerry, if you have to leave or if you can stick around, but if you can stick around, I was just going to let people jump in and ask their questions. I know Bill, really wanted to talk a little bit about the police.
Yeah, definitely. I can stick around for a bit. So.
All right, people jump on in if you want to ask your question.
Hi, Jerry. This is Kadrian.
Hey.
I'm calling. I've always questioned if legislators are in some way required to review the EEOC and MCAD type workplace grievances, because the sense that I get is that either they're not aware that this is a major issue or they're pretending.
Yeah. I think we have a combination of the two. I 100% agree with you. And no, there's no requirement there, and there should be, right? There should be a review of what's going on in these cases. There should be a review of what the EEOC is doing, what cases they're taking, how quickly they are, in essence, finding no cause, because the vast majority of time they find no cause, right? How often they just simply jump to providing the right to sue letter rather than even going through conciliation. So I think a lot of it is a lack of information. And one of our jobs, I believe, at the NWBC is to provide legislators as much of that information as we can. But at the same time, I also think it's an ignoring of the problem, because, this is nothing new. This is 30 years of research. And, to me, if you're going to be on a labor committee, in any level of legislature, whether it's state level or federal level, then you should know what's going on in the workplace. So, but yeah, so I think it's a combination of those two. I think you're absolutely right.
I'll jump in. Jerry, thank you so very much. This information has been overwhelmingly amazing.
Thanks.
I feel like I could sit here and talk with you all day based on like you literally almost 95% of what you said, I could write a story on. It just
Wow.
there's just so many things. And you did kind of mention this because you mentioned the military. And this is my first question, so I'll just throw it out there. The police departments love to hide behind the idea that since they are paramilitary organizations and therefore the way that they behave has a defined purpose, kind of like the intimidation and the hazing that kind of happens in academies and in boot camps and things like that, so that they cannot be considered bullying. Well, an argument could be made to some degree that there are reasons for this in a training academy environment to make everybody part of the team and all that, which I don't completely believe, but that's what they go for. It has no place in the department. Once you've graduated and you're on the job, it has no place, but it only ramps up from there.
Yeah.
And so the culture of policing just seems to hide behind that all the time. And so I'm curious if you have any experience with that.
Yeah, so a little bit, and a little bit of research on that. Actually, the reason I know about the Colin Powell report is because one of my dissertation committee members asked me that very question about the military for my A exam for him. And so in writing that, yeah, you're right. The police force not only tends to view themselves as paramilitary, but they also, when they hire the trainers, they pick the extreme trainers, right? Not the ones that Colin Powell would pick, but the ones that you would sort of envision, back in the old, 1970s, 1980s war movies about boot camp, right? And there's no evidence that builds teams. In fact, it's just the opposite. It actually destroys teams. It creates a lack of trust amongst team members. And there are better ways to build teams. And it doesn't mean that everything is going to be nice and pleasant throughout, right? Because there are unpleasant parts of that job. And there are sort of, parts of that job that you have to be prepared for unpleasantness, and people need to be prepared for that. One of the things I used to do all the time in training supervisors and managers, I used 12 O'Clock High, an old war movie about World War II. And initially, when you watch that movie, you think that Colonel Savage or General Savage is a bully, right? Because he's very blunt and he's very direct and he can be a little bit harsh. But then you step back and you start to look at, well, what's he really doing? And how is he treating his men? And what's he doing with the people in his platoon? And you start to realize, wait a second, this is not theory X management. This is actually theory Y management. And he's being supportive, but at the same time, focusing on the task when he needs to focus on the task, but building the relationship when he needs to. So there has to be a change. And I think that people who begin to engage in applying what I would call organizational behavior research. So in other words, they're building teams or they're building leaders. They should be more well versed in that research because they oftentimes apply it wrong. And I think that's what's going on with the military. I think it's what's going on with the police force. I know it's what's going on in K-12. And so if they could just really dig in and figure out, wait a second, team building doesn't mean we break people down and make them feel meaningless. It means we build people up and make them see how each of them brings a different piece to the puzzle, right? And you really want people that aren't the same on a team, because that's what builds a team, right? I mean, I hate to use sports analogies because they sound sort of stupid, but Giancarlo Stanton, I think that's his name, right? Great baseball player, but you sure don't want him playing 9 positions, right? You can't have him at every position. You need different pieces, and then you need to build them up. All is important, and so just that whole idea is just misguided because it's not achieving the goals they want.
Exactly. Wow, that's awesome. I would love to participate with you in any way, shape possible. I'd even
Excellent.
be, happy to do some investigating or things like that. And as a side note, you kind of mentioned this, and I was thinking about it while you were speaking. I tried designing my own major in college in the 80s, and it was all centered around organizational change and development.
Nice.
And psychology, sociology, human resources, and personnel arbitration. And it got shot down 3 times in a row. So it's just it boggles the mind that people
Yeah.
don't seem to understand that those things, when you look at HR and how they aren't there to help you as an employee, they really should be. And by creating
Yep.
systems like I was trying to create back then, it would be a much better place to, be in a work environment and be happy to go to work.
Yes.
And be excited about participating in work and contributing to work and feel like you're going to be listened to at work. And so whatever I can do to help you with that, I'd be more than happy to jump in.
Excellent. I so much appreciate that. Please send me an email. And if you get a chance, sign on at the Dignity at Work Act. I am super excited to work with you, Bill. And thank you so much. And I would love to do some work on that curriculum too. As in higher ed, we need so much more of it. I just posted today, on Facebook, I hate to admit I do post quite a bit on Facebook, but said, business schools need to change what they're doing, and they need to focus on these different outcomes. And that's where we should be. And I'd love to work with you on all kinds of things. So I look forward to it. And great meeting you, by the way.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to, Kathy, if you wanted to jump in. You're muted still, Kath.
You'd think I'd know by now. Anyway, sorry about that. So I've dealt with pretty very severe harassment in correctional settings. And then later when I worked in criminal justice reform, up to including death threats and attempted rape. So I've dealt with that. But then, and I've dealt with suicidal ideations and PTSD, all that. I'm now at a workplace where I work for a white man who is just incredible. He's very supportive and he helps me build my career. He has a blind spot. When another white man harasses me, he doesn't handle it.
Yeah.
So I'm really surprised by that, how he's so great and feels like very consciously great. And I'm dealing with it now because I'm dealing with a guy. It's not huge, but he tried to bring me into I had an idea and then it got rejected, and then he presented it slightly differently, but pretty much the same way. And they're accepting it, and he's going to make a lot of money off of it. And I really torpedoed it. I said, no, it's not legit. That's not fair. We can't do that. And we can't take my idea and he makes money off of it.
Yeah.
And they did say no to it, but since then he's been kind of trying to torpedo me. And at one point in the chat, because we teach online, so he can chat with me, he writes, "You just belittled me." And I said, after class, I said, "Let's talk about this. There was no belittling you." And Josh was like, "No, she didn't do that." So because he sits there in class. And then more recently, we had a really odd dynamic where at one point in class, we have pretty prescribed things we do, and it's pretty, settled. And at one point he goes, "Kathy, it looks like the group needs us to stretch. So why don't you leave them in stretching for 2 minutes?" I'm thinking, we're running behind. I have a foot of space, so they're basically going to watch my stomach stretching if I stand up. Because he's proposed we stand up. And I said no. And he said, "Oh no, we need to do this." And then I said no like 3 times, and then I kind of ended up, it just got messy. And then I teach a class on conflict, so one of the students wrote, about that. I don't know what to do because it's hard to get through to a white man that another white man is oppressive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So 2 possibilities of what I see. One is, the discriminatory effect, even if the intent is not there. So there's this subconscious level of a discriminatory view, right? Men are this, women are this in the workplace. And that's problematic. The second thing that I see is some of my colleagues have recently approached me with this idea, or maybe some of their research that says one of the big problems is people don't know how to deal with bullying in the workplace, so they just don't. And so it sounds like your supervisor needs to be trained on how to deal with this issue, including identifying it, but then also how to remedy it. So, one of the things that I always, suggest to organizations as part of their investigation policy is they always should first ask the target, or not first, but at the end of their interview with the target, ask the target, what do you want to see done? right? Because that gives you a great avenue of how you might be able to address the situation. Okay. And then the second thing is, part of that investigation is you've got to look for motives. I said early on, intent doesn't matter, but intent does matter at the remedy stage. And I mentioned that at the very beginning. And so when you start to dig for motives for the people who are engaging in this, it also gives you a route of how you have to address it. If the motives are bad, you just got to be strong, right? We don't need people who are intentionally bullying in the workplace. Doesn't matter what other value they bring, you need to get rid of them. In this case, the intent might be, a mistake. And so training might work. That is, by the way, the mistaken bully or harasser is the exception, not the rule. The rule is they do know what they're doing, and the best route is to get rid of them. But it sounds like your supervisor needs some training on how you identify and how you remedy workplace bullying. And if he's not willing to get that, or if maybe he's not willing to have that offered for the whole organization, which might be a way to get him to get the training without it isolating him or pointing to him specifically, then I'm not sure that there's a great solution other than if you're willing to take the step of saying, this is what happened to me. This is what I want to see as a resolution. So in essence, you're sort of filling out your own interview form for what happened and, and giving that to him.
Yeah, because what happened in our last class, and we teach in front of people who are divorcing, was my co-teacher made a comment that, if I have a colleague that I work with, I might not like them, but I have to show them respect.
Yeah.
And I thought, why are you talking about that in divorcing class? This is you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, it's like, if this is a class on workplace conflict, fine, but we don't do that. We talk about how people in divorce act.
Yeah. So this was in front of the whole class.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's got to stop. And that reminds me, it's not yelling at you down the hallway, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing. And, and one of the things to keep in mind is when we look at severity and pervasiveness, we always look at the context, and being in front of customers or being in front of clients or being in front of students ups the severity level of that. And that's recognized from a legal standpoint. And so I believe that you're dealing with something that's pretty serious, even from a legal standpoint. And if they don't get in trouble because of what's happening to you, they are going to get in legal trouble at some point because it's going to happen to others.
Oh, okay.
And this is why also from an HR standpoint, it's so good to have a law on your side. Because, I'm telling you, when I would go to supervisors and be able to say, if you don't do this, here's what's going to happen because of the law, it's a lot stronger than being able to go to them as an HR manager and say, when you do this, you're harming workers, and you can be a lot better by not harming them. Because a lot of times then they just ignore you. But all of a sudden when you say, hey, you got some legal ramifications here, all of a sudden they start listening. So
what would be the law that I could quote to them?
Well, I think I think they're really bordering on unlawful harassment. So my question would be, would they make that same statement to a male worker in the same place? And even, and you also have to think about intersectional discrimination. So even if they would to a male worker, would they to a white male worker? Okay. And if not, that means they're treating you differently based upon the intersectionality of gender and color. And that is potentially unlawful.
Gotcha, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I see Kadrian has her hand up. Yep.
Hi, Jerry. During the course of my research, I came across, I posted in the chat, an article where canine dogs have protection in the workplace. And although I love dogs, I have a dog myself, I love like a family member. But how do you justify not having protection for human beings over animals? And how can we use that as some way to say that, okay, we as human beings are being discriminated against or something like that?
Yeah, no, I think that's excellent. And I think it's a great piece of the movement building that people understand this, So if you don't mind, I would love if you would email me that, because I would love to see that as part of a rotation of what we share from the National Workplace Bullying Coalition on our Facebook page and elsewhere. And I think that's a great piece of building this movement, to say, wait a second, we know we can provide this level of protection. We do it for canines, which should be protected, right? Because they are completely helpless, but
Yeah.
we should also protect workers. And if we can do it there, we can do it here. So
Yeah.
if you don't mind, if you would email that to me, that's a great find.
It seems like the same argument that they present in the article for the canines definitely applies to human beings. But yes,
Exactly.
I'll definitely send that to you. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Anybody else? Miguel, did you wanna? I know you came on camera and you had lots of chat things. Just wondering if you wanted to jump in or.
Not much. Just kind of taking everything in. Just kind of wanted to mention again, and uplift that I'm definitely willing to be a participant in any type of studies, just to get a better understanding of myself and help folks as well. So definitely open to that, and any other trainings as well. This was really great. I jumped in a little late, but this was great.
Excellent. Thank you, Miguel. And definitely I will take you up on that offer. Anyone who's interested, please visit our website to sign in, but also send me an email, and I will make sure that we touch base with you, that I touch base with you, and that we need all the help that we can get. And we need to build a movement. So, and the time is now, we can't delay any longer.
Wonderful. That's probably a good statement to end with, since we're already 15 minutes over. The time is now. We can't wait. Thanks again. This was such great information. Clearly, everyone had some great takeaways, and we have our orders now. We got to get the word out and let people know this cannot continue. Thank you
all for being
so
here.
much, Jerry. We really, really appreciate you.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
He does work with a white female teacher. I haven't spoken with her. If he treats her okay, does that mean it wouldn't be unlawful harassment?
No. A lot of people try to do that. Like a lot of defendants try to say, well, I don't treat this person that way, so I can't have discriminated against this person who's similarly situated. That's not the case at all. In fact, it's usually one target at a time. So what matters is if he would treat other situated individuals differently than what he treats you. So yeah.
Okay. Well, also he's making money with her and not with me, and I think that money comes down to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's not an excuse for harassment, though. So,
okay.
Okay.
Great. Beautiful. Thanks so much. That's very
all right. Thank you. Thank all of you. Appreciate it.